Hi, Manny Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline Lawyer. This is an episode in our series entitled Busting Industry Myths. And the myth that we are busting today says this: when buyer and seller are in a transaction that includes a Form 22B home sale contingency addendum, and the buyer succeeds in finding a buyer to purchase buyer's property, then at that point, the original seller and buyer should include a Form 22Q, the pending sale contingency addendum, into their original transaction. That is false. It's an industry myth, and it creates enormous trouble in the transaction. The truth is, when buyer and seller have a Form 22B home sale contingency addendum in their transaction, Form 22B handles everything that happens between buyer and seller with respect to buyer's requirement for sale of their property from beginning to end. So when buyer succeeds in entering a purchase and sale agreement for the sale of buyer's property, Form 22B controls what happens between the original buyer and seller. If that sale between buyer and buyer's buyer closes, Form 22B says what happens. If that sale between buyer and buyer's buyer fails, Form 22B says what happens. You do not need to include a Form 22Q, the pending sale contingency addendum, in a transaction that includes Form 22B, the home sale contingency addendum, ever. And more importantly, if you do include a Form 22Q into an existing Form 22B transaction, then you will create confusion within the contract itself regarding the closing date. Because when you add 22Q, 22Q supplies one definition of when the transaction will close, which contradicts the closing date established by 22B. So now you have a conflict in terms regarding the closing date of the transaction. And that conflict exists because you as the broker, and remember, you're held to the standard of care of a lawyer, not only when you complete the forms, but when you select the form to use. When you selected a Form 22Q to inject into an existing home sale contingency transaction, 22B transaction, you selected the wrong form, and in doing so, you created a conflict, an internal conflict of the terms of agreement as it relates to closing. Don't ever, ever do that. So we're busting the industry myth that says when you have a 22B transaction and buyer succeeds in finding a buyer for their home, you should then add a 22Q to the transaction. That's wrong. It will get you into trouble every single time. If you want to hear about some more industry myths that we can bust, tune into one of our classes entitled Busting Industry Myths. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please ask me a question by visiting the Legal Hotline at WA Realtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.